Welcome to part 2 of the lecture for Module 1 on Physical Foundations. So again, in this entire module, um, we're covering the region pre-contact, pre-European contact, which you should have already watched. This one, we're doing the mission period, and then the last part will be on post-Mexican independence. So first of all, when did Europeans make contact with the California coast? The first person to do so was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, which name you will undoubtedly recognize from Cabrillo National Monument. He arrived in 1542. He was searching for a northwest passage, but instead discovered the coast of California. And he claimed the land for Spain. He was actually Portuguese, but he was flying under a Spanish flag, so he claimed the land for Spain, not really having much regard for the fact that there were people already living here. The next person to make contact was Sir Francis Drake in 1579. And he claimed the land for English. So again, this is a period of time where Europeans are starting to colonize. They're kind of sailing around the world, landing in places and saying this belongs to our country. But the Spanish prevailed with the claim, but there really wasn't sustained contact until post the 1760s. So before that, there were some effects, and some Europeans came and went, but they really did not settle into the area until the 1760s. And this had profound effects on Native American populations in the region, in the whole continent, really. But we're going to talk about what some of those effects were. This period has often been portrayed as this kind of benevolent relationship between the Native Americans and the Europeans that showed up, that they were very welcoming of them. But more accurately, Native Americans were continually adapting in multiple ways to survive continued invasions by Europeans, and especially after the 1760s with permanent settlements, they had to do so, and they did so in multiple ways. The Spanish established missions, which you have undoubtedly come across if you've spent any time living in California. They established 21 missions in Alta California. They established the first mission in 1769, and these were basically religious outposts. They were staffed by priests, the Franciscans, and their main goal was to convert Native Americans to Christianity. And the idea there wasn't just that they needed to spread Christianity, but also they wanted to create Spanish colonial citizens. So converting Native Americans to Christianity was a way of quote-unquote civilizing them and making them good, productive colonial citizens. And the goal was originally to return these lands back to native populations, but in order to kind of serve that colonial model where these places are basically, in service to the crown, and they are benefiting the metropole or the home country of Spain. And we're going to see in the next part that significantly changed after Mexican independence. And again, we want to remember, as during this time period, California was part of Mexico, not part of the United States yet. These were not solely religious institutions, though. They had their own political and economic motivations as well. Their main goal was to convert Native Americans to Christianity, but they certainly weren't just doing that. We also had presidios that were set up during the time. Presidios are military installations that were housed with Spanish soldiers. This is the Presidio of Monterey. There's probably the most famous one in San Francisco. And then there were also pueblos, which were settlements that were civilian populations. Um, we'll talk about ranchos in the next part. And so this conversion to Christianity, Native Americans were referred to as neophytes, which was a term for Native Americans who were converted to Christianity and then lived on the mission. So the idea was it wasn't just converting you to Christianity and then you were going to go back to your lands and live your life. It was that you were going to be converted to Christianity and stay at the mission and worked for the mission. And so this is, in a sense, a source of forced labor for the missions in order to uh, grow food and do a variety of other manual labor. And the conditions there were often terrible, and people were forced to stay once they stayed. They weren't allowed just to leave. So again, the Native Americans resisted missions in a variety of ways, both violent and nonviolent. Um, they did so nonviolently through the retention of religious practices as a form of resistance. So the idea of converting to Christianity is that you're supposed to abandon all of your native beliefs and practices. And many of them continue to practice these, also by simply fleeing, which some Native Americans successfully fled missions. Very often, though, they were hunted down and brought back and physically punished as a deterrent for others leaving. And then they also, there were plenty of violent uprisings against the mission system, including an attack on Mission San Diego and Santa Barbara. But again, not this kind of accepting of this entire system that was coming into play at the time. It's really important to understand the effects of disease introduced by Europeans during this time period, from the late 1800s, the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s, all the way through the 1800s. There were huge population declines due to the diseases introduced by Europeans. And upwards of 50% of the population, and by some estimates more, died by 1845. So if you think about the 300,000 people who were living there at the time of contact, and now you're talking a little over 100,000 by 1845. And this has a massive effect on your tribe's ability to stay cohesive and defend itself. And these included multiple outbreaks of diseases such as tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, and cholera, things that certainly also killed Europeans during the time, but Europeans had built up some natural immunities to these diseases that they had evolved alongside with that Native Americans did not. There was also venereal disease that was spread by soldiers, sometimes forcibly, to Native American women, and some of these venereal diseases led to the effective sterilization of these women, and so you had women also producing less children. So these populations, again, really decimated during this time period and shrunk considerably. And the conditions at the missions were not great by any means. Again, we're talking about forced labor, so people working at the mission basically without compensation, frequent things like beatings to get them to subordinate. Also a complete suppression of Native American culture and also prevention of migration. Even Native Americans who were living in permanent or semi-permanent settlements migrated throughout the landscape, and the Europeans were really forcing upon them a different view of the land, of a land that was kind of cordoned off and owned, and you stayed put in one spot. And then there was also the segregation and very frequently rape of women. Women were kept separate from men to secure their chastity, but if these women disobeyed, or often they were raped by soldiers as well, which again led to that spread of venereal disease. The Franciscans, however, saw themselves as fathers who were looking after their children. So you're going to write about Junipero Serra. Your reading for chapter 2, which if you haven't done, you should be doing soon, talks about Father Mariano Payeras, who really were very conflicted about Native Americans. They wanted them to kind of submit to this European lifestyle and saw them as irrational for not doing so, and saw it as the work of God, that they basically had to turn these people into a God-fearing people who lived a correct lifestyle. And so again, you're going to watch a two-part, relatively short documentary about Junipero Serra, and he has been called both a saint and a promoter of genocide. He is an extraordinarily controversial figure. And again, your book writes about another priest who is a little bit less known. Junipero Serra was in the news a lot recently, and you're going to read a little article about that because Pope Francis visited the United States and canonized, or basically named him as a saint. And a lot of Native Americans were very upset about this. But a lot of people believe that he was a great spreader of Christianity, and he needs to be judged by the time that he lived in. And that's what your second exercise is going to be about. So that is the end of the second part of lecture for this module. You're going to move on to watch those videos about Junipero Serra and read that article about his canonization, and then you're going to proceed on to the third part of lecture.